Every moment of emotional distress that you experience has two layers to it. There is the objective reality of the events you experienced, and then there is the subjective, internal interpretation of those events. In other words, to say it a little bit less jargony, there's things that happen to you, and then there's the stories you tell yourself about the things that happen to you. And both of those factors combine to create some level of emotional distress in response to your life. For some of us, the majority of the distress we experience simply comes from the actual things that happen to us. Some things in life just hurt. They're going to feel some certain way, and there's not a realistic way that you can make them not hurt or hurt less. Things like grief, for example, job loss, alienation from parents or children. There are events in life that are just going to cause us a certain amount of pain. And the only way you can realistically reduce or avoid that pain essentially is to do something pathological, like misuse substances, manipulate food intake, engage in really intense distraction behaviors like impulsive gambling or shopping, or impulsive sexual behavior, pornography use, things like that. But sometimes the majority of the distress that we experience, either in certain situations or maybe even in our lives in general, comes not from the actual things that happen to us, but from the stories we tell ourselves about the things that happen to us. As human beings with big frontal lobes, we have a desire to understand the pain that we have experienced, to make meaning out of the events that happen to us, and to look to see, are there patterns here? And if there are patterns, do they say something about me? Am I experiencing this type of pain over and over and over again because the world is a harsh place or because I have bad luck? Or is it because there is something wrong with me? Am I causing this somehow? Is this a me problem? Some amount of this type of thinking can be helpful. We don't want to be completely naive or completely ignorant to problems that we have, to patterns that hurt us or get us into difficult situations. So we do need to be able to self-reflect and to take a hard, honest look at ourselves from time to time. But people who have chronic mental health conditions like depression and anxiety have a very, very strong tendency to overestimate their role in negative events. And it is essentially a similar thought process to the thought process of a narcissist, but the directionality is inverted, where a narcissist wants to believe that they are the source of positivity and pleasantness and optimism and good feelings in those around them. Someone with depression or someone with anxiety tends to believe the opposite. When we see somebody having a bad day or experiencing difficult emotions, or when we ourselves go through something difficult, our brains have a natural tendency to turn that around and try to figure out, how is this my fault? How did I make this happen somehow? I have a little bit of a personal theory on this. I don't have data to back this up. It's an anecdotal observation from therapy. But I see this pattern especially strong in people who have experienced a lot of relational trauma, particularly abuse at the hands of a partner or a parent or an authority figure of some type. And my theory is that when we are in a helpless situation, when we are in a situation where we are being hurt and we do not actually have the power to stop the hurt, we have a tendency to try to make it our fault because it's essentially we're trying to crack the code. If I can figure out what I am doing, air quotes, wrong to cause, also air quotes, this person to hurt me, and I could then stop doing that thing, I could regain my sense of safety in the world. That is, of course, not a true statement because if somebody wants to hurt you, bully you, abuse you, they are simply going to find a reason. They may even say to you, like this may not be your idea that you cooked up in your own head. They might even say to you, I am doing this because you did this. And if you stopped doing this, I would stop doing this. And if you've been in a situation like that, you probably know that that is a lie. Because if you do, in fact, stop doing the thing that they're blaming the abuse on, they simply find a different reason to abuse you. So it doesn't actually work. But it's very difficult not to internalize that. And so I think I think anyone with depression and anxiety has this pattern. If you have comorbid trauma or abuse, I think the pattern just gets exponentially stronger because your brain is all that much more trained from a like a functional survival perspective is if you could find a way that it's your fault and then you could stop doing the thing that caused it to happen, you could regain your sense of safety. So basically, all that was to say there are some understandable reasons that we fall into these patterns of thought, but I believe that for most of us, they become pathological. Because if the majority of the distress that you experience in your life comes from the story you tell yourself about the things that happened to you and what they mean, that means that the majority of the emotional distress that you experience is optional and potentially artificial. Because if you have a tendency to overestimate your role in negative events, you are feeling pain about things that are not true. You are viewing yourself through this certain lens, this belief system of negativity that you have determined is the story of your life. Like, I'm a failure, I'm unlovable, I'm a loser, I break everything I touch. Fill in the blank with your core belief system about what's so screwed up about you. And if you see every bad thing that happens to you through that lens, it looks like a never ending pattern of defeat and failure. But you have set yourself up to see it that way by calling that the premise. This is kind of a weird comparison, but it's something that A, drives me nuts, and B, shows what I'm talking about really well. Many of you have probably heard this common cultural saying, at least this might just be an America thing, this common cultural saying that celebrity deaths occur in threes. I don't know where this came from, but I've been hearing it for as long as I can remember. And so if one or two celebrities pass away, people are always like, "Ooh, who's the third one going to be?" And sometimes they'll leave, and it's such a why do we do this weird crap? I don't even get it, but we'll start to like not we I don't. Some people do. But we'll start to be like, "Oh, I think this person's going to die next." But here's the stupid thing about that saying. There's never a time frame attached to it. 3 is just an arbitrary number. You could insert literally any like, sometimes it does look that way because that's the expectation you've set up. So when 2 people die, like, let's say 2 celebrities die in the same month, and you're like, "Okay, here comes the 3rd one," and then another celebrity dies 3 months later, and since you expected it to come in threes, once the 3rd celebrity dies, you close that loop and you say, "That was the pattern, there was the 3rd person." And then another celebrity dies a month later, and you say, "Oh, that's now the start of the next 3." You could fill in any number here because you're not actually basing it in reality. You are closing the loop and then starting a new loop every 3 people. So if you said they happen in fives, you would just count every 5th celebrity death as being the end of that pattern, and the 6th would be the start of a new one. There's no time frame attached to it. It's purely this artificial belief we develop because we have set up our expectations in that way. And we do that with ourselves too. If you believe that you are a failure, then every experience that either is failure objectively or could be perceived as failure becomes a part of that pattern and supports and grows this belief system. But all of the experiences you have that do not match your perception of yourself as being a failure are rejected from becoming a pattern. They're the exceptions to the rule, right? Even if your number of successes objectively are greater quantitatively than your number of failures, if you've decided that failure is the pattern, you string those together as a chain of events, and everything else gets externalized and does not become a part of your inner narrative. If we could just learn to take events as they are and not add a bunch of negative internalized meaning to them, the amount of suffering that we experience would go down so dramatically. There's a lot of examples I could use to exemplify this, but let's take an example that the vast majority of people watching or listening to this will have experienced, which is somebody breaks up with you. Somebody ends a romantic relationship with you, and you either didn't want that to happen or didn't see it coming. It's not a good thing. You're not like, oh, thank goodness, dodged a bullet there. You didn't want it to happen. What does that objectively mean? So remember, we have every experience of emotional distress has the two components, right? Just kind of going back to the intro here. We have the actual factual events that occurred, meaning anyone, kind of watching this happen to you from the outside would see that and be like, yes, that definitely did happen. You are correct. And then there are the things that we think that it means. So somebody breaks up with you. Objectively, what does that mean? It means that as of that day, you are not in a romantic relationship with that person. And it probably means that at least for the near future, now this is a little bit of a story. It probably means that at least for the near future, that person is not going to be an option for you romantically. It doesn't always mean that, but it usually means that. So realistically, the objective reality of getting broken up with is that you are now single and the size of your dating pool has shrunk by one person. If you ended it right there, if you did not, and I know you can't actually do this, but just hypothetically, if you did not allow yourself to infer any meaning from that and just took it for what it actually is, how much does that hurt? It's not zero, don't get me wrong. It's not gonna feel, I'm not saying now this is suddenly good or neutral. It doesn't feel good, but is it a crisis? Is it something that would spiral you for weeks or months or years if you just took it as the objective truth of what happened? Probably not. It is the subjective, it is the story that we tack on to the experience that is going to make this a source of despair. Because you're going to tell yourself that it means something. You're going to tell yourself, I wasn't good enough for that person. Or I'm not good enough for anyone. I'm going to be alone forever. I'm unlovable. There is something fundamentally broken about me. Nobody wants to deal with my mental illness. I'm too screwed up to be in a healthy relationship. Again, insert belief system here. And that so-called truth is where the majority of your emotional distress is going to come from. Because you're going to take this experience and you're going to tell yourself that this means something much more eternal about you. You're going to tell yourself that this means something about your future, something about every romantic relationship you're ever going to be in, something about who you are on the inside. And what I want to make sure you do not miss in that is that every single thing that I just said in that part of this video is a theory. That is literally all it is. It is your theory about why that person broke up with you. You will never actually know the reason. You won't. Even if that person tells you the reason, they may not be being honest with you. They may not even be being honest with themselves. I have a really silly story about that, but when my wife and I first started dating, I had a moment, it was really early. I'm gonna say like 3 weeks in, where I realized this is a person that if I remain in a relationship with her, she is going to force me to grow. This is not a relationship where I will be allowed to be a stagnant human being. I had never experienced that before. And although I kind of wanted it, it also freaked me out a little bit. And there was actually a moment, it was like our first, it wasn't even a fight, and I don't even remember what it was about. It was just one of those silly, like early on relationship. I don't even want to call it an argument. It was a minor disagreement. But I knew enough about her at this point to be like, this is going to be a pretty serious and pretty intense relationship if it continues. And I wasn't 100% sure if I was ready for that. And I remember in the middle of this disagreement we had with her, I made almost like a little half-hearted attempt to break up because I was a little freaked out by how well she understood me. I remember saying that it was something, like, "Oh, I'm not gonna change this part about myself, so you gotta either just, like, learn how to deal with it, or you might as well just leave now because it's not gonna change." That wasn't the real reason. Like, I was scared. I was scared of having a real vulnerable relationship with someone where we grow together. So if it had ended then, thankfully it didn't, but if that conversation had ended the relationship, the reason I would have said to her that it ended, I don't even remember what I think it was about, like, playing video games or something. It wasn't actually about the thing. It was about my fear of intimacy, my fear of vulnerability, my fear of commitment, but that's not what I said. And I think a lot of times when we get broken up with, people don't tell us the real reason, and they may not even know the real reason. Like, I know this stuff now as I'm reflecting on the early stages of our relationship. At that time, I don't know if I would have actually been able to say, even to myself, I am a little scared about the level of vulnerability and growth I think this relationship will require of me. I think it would have been more like something like, "I don't know how I feel." Like, we don't always know. So you're never going to know. Every explanation you have, and again, this is the breakup is just an example. This is everything bad that happens to you. Everything that causes an unpleasant emotion, you don't actually know why. And all of these interpretations in your mind, they are your theories. They are your mind's attempt, your logical, rational human mind with its big overgrown frontal lobes, trying to make sense of an often senseless and chaotic world and society. That's what all of this is. And for the majority of us, I think that's where the majority of our pain comes from. Not the now, that's not true for everybody. So let me just little disclaimer here. Some of you have experienced horrific trauma. And in some of your cases, like the majority of your distress is from the actual things you've been through. So I'm not saying that's everybody, but I do think it's most of us. I think it is most human beings in general, and I think it's probably most people watching this video. Even if it's not you, some portion of your distress comes from the narrative, comes from the theory, comes from the story. Even if it's less than half, it's the only half you can really control. Like, there's always going to be painful events in life. There's always going to be horrible things that happen. People are always going to treat you like crap. These are just I'm sorry to be so like nihilistic today, but I mean, these are inevitable truths about the world that we live in, and they're not going to stop being true anytime soon. So if we can't completely eradicate that source of pain, what we can do, whether it's a lot or a little, is take this part that our brains add on top, try to cut as much of that off as possible. That's what this is all about. Now, I realize I haven't actually given you any tools on how to do that, and that's where we're going to end for today. I have a few strategies that you can use to minimize the amount of emotional distress you experience that comes from the narrative, the subjective theory. First is to call things what they are. Your brain takes language very literally. And the part of your brain that generates your emotional reactions to stimuli does not have critical thinking ability. So even if you hear something or say something and you're not being completely serious about it, you may notice that you have an emotional reaction to that thing, even if you know it's not true. For example, if I told you right now, I've recently been diagnosed with a terminal illness and I have 6 months to live. That's not true. And I know it's not true. But when I said that, there was a little bit of anxiety that happened. That's my limbic system reacting to the language that I just used. My frontal lobes know that's just a ridiculous thing I'm saying to make a point in this video. But my limbic system goes, oh no, we're going to die. This is how our brains work. And so you have to be really specific with yourself about the language you use. When you have a breakup, let's say, when someone breaks up with you, and you say in your head, this is because I am a loser, that's a theory, but you're stating it as a fact and it's going to feel like a fact in your brain. Your limbic system is not going to respond to that as I'm thinking that I'm a loser right now. It's going to generate an emotional response to I am a loser. This is an objective truth and this is a reality that I face. But it's not. It's your theory. And that's the first intervention that we can try to work on reducing some of this optional suffering is to call things theories, thoughts, impulses, ideas, questions. Preface the statement in your mind with the type of statement it actually is. When we don't do this, everything we think sounds like a truth, sounds like a fact, and that amplifies the emotional response we have to that mental statement. Call things what they are. Call a theory, call a thought, call a belief. Even if you don't do anything else to change it, just using that wording technique will start to soften the emotional reaction that you have to that thought. Second technique you can use is to simply remember that you have something called a negativity bias. Your brain is always going to twist things to make them more negative than they actually are and more your fault than they actually are. Because for most of human history, those have been adaptive survival traits. For the vast majority of the time that we humans have been here alive on Earth, it has been and I'm not saying these are not true, but they are a little bit less true than they have been. It has been a violent and dangerous place where ongoing survival was not guaranteed from one day to the next. For some of us, that is still true. But for many of us, that's a lot less true than it was, a few hundred years ago, for example. If for no other reason, I'm not necessarily saying that people have gotten better, but we have developed things that allow us to I mean, we live longer. That's not an opinion, it's objectively true. Because we've had advances in things like electricity and heat and food growth and medicine, we're less likely to die from logistical stuff. We as a race are less likely to die from just like logistical things than we were a few hundred years ago. But for most of human history, the things that killed people were like wounds and starvation and things like that. And so It was evolutionarily advantageous to be a cowardly, pessimistic, worst case scenario, catastrophic thinker. Because if you thought negatively all the time, you were more prepared for the actual crises that did occur with some amount of regularity. That's not really the life that most of us live anymore these days, at least not in a literal life or death sense. Most of us are not facing mortality every single day. We still feel like we are because we are fine-tuned to work that way. So your brain is always going to try to find the problems. It's always going to spotlight the flaws and the shortcomings and the failures because it is trained to do that because that has been what we have needed to survive for most of human history. Recently, for a lot of us, that has kind of flip-flopped. And now those traits tend to hold us back from things like relationship opportunities, career opportunities, educational opportunities. We're in a weird time in life where we kind of need to be a little bit more brave, even though that used to like just get us killed all the time. I don't have a quick fix for that because I think that's going to take hundreds of years of brain development to kind of smooth out, and who knows what the future holds for our society. Before I get on too much of a tangent with that, let me get back to my original point, which is that remember that your brain skews negative. And when things feel like this is a me problem, this is this stupid pattern that's going to ruin my life and destroy everything I love and stop me from achieving all my goals, you're trained to think that way. And it's not necessarily in line with reality. Even if you don't know like what the reality of the situation is or how to challenge that thought, just remembering I have a negativity bias, and so I probably see this as being worse than it actually is will also help you get some distance from the intensity of that emotional reaction and help you stay regulated and grounded. And the third technique you can try to use to counteract some of these hurtful stories we tell ourselves is to keep searching for alternate explanations. So remember the comparison I made earlier about the celebrity deaths occurring in threes. Once the third person dies, you stop counting anything as part of the pattern because your expectation has been fulfilled, essentially. If you think you already know the truth about who you are, what you are, and how your life is going to play out, as soon as you can interpret an event in a way that fits the narrative that you already have, you stop looking for answers because you think you've already answered the question. We don't continue to search for answers to a question that our brain considers satisfactorily answered. We don't have a reason to do that. I already know why that happened. It's because I'm such a screw up all the time. But there are usually going to be a lot of possible reasons why something could happen. Many theoretical explanations. But as soon as we lock on the one that fits our narrative, we stop looking for other reasons. That's something that we can train ourselves out of. Even if you think you already know the answer, even if it's like, this really looks on the surface like just another one of those things that seems to happen way more to me than it happens to other people, just keep searching. Even if you don't believe it could be anything else, always try to generate at least two or three plausible potential theories for why that thing might have happened. I think that person broke up with me because they just don't like because I'm just not a very likable person. That's what I think. That's my first theory. That's the theory that's explained everything else that's happened to me in my life. So I think. But what just as a thought exercise, if nothing else, what else could it have been? What other possible reasons could there be? Like, why do people break up? Maybe they were afraid of commitment. Maybe I know this one's going to sound some certain way, but I've seen this happen all the time. Maybe they were intimidated by me. Maybe they were intimidated by my intellect. Maybe there was something about me that freaked them out a little bit, not in a you're screwed up kind of way, but in a I don't know if I'm ready for this kind of way. These are real reasons people break up. These are real things. And even if you don't think it fits the scenario that you're describing, always have at least two or three possible reasons why painful things happen to you. Even just introducing other theories into your psychological ecosystem will once again slightly, at minimum, decrease the intensity of your emotional reaction to that scenario. Well, as you can probably tell, I seem to be losing my voice a little bit. I've been not totally healthy the last couple of weeks, so I think I'm going to end this video now before I am unable to speak. That was pretty much all my points anyway. I hope this was helpful. I hope these are tools that you can use in your own battle, and I will see you next time. Take care.